Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving into some pretty choppy waters today.
Choppy is right.
We're looking at a couple of executive orders from, well, President Trump
Right.
that are really shaking things up in the education world.
Yeah, they're causing quite a stir.
Yeah, and one's taking aim at what he calls critical race theory and radical gender ideology.
Hmm.
In K-12, so that's, your elementary schools, middle schools, high
Yeah.
schoolers, the whole shebang.
Right. The whole K through 12
Yeah,
system.
exactly. And then the other one is focusing on college campuses.
Uh-huh.
And specifically, this one's got its sights set on anti-Semitism,
Yeah.
and even more specifically, on international students.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So we're talking about two very different levels of education,
Mhm.
but both orders are tapping into this really, I think, fundamental anxiety about what's being taught in our schools and universities.
Yeah.
And who gets to decide that?
And who gets to decide that? Yeah, so buckle up, folks, because the fallout from these orders could be huge, and the debate is just getting started.
Absolutely. It's going to be a long road ahead, and it's going to be bumpy.
Okay, so let's break this down a bit. Let's start with the first executive order, the one targeting K-12 schools.
Okay.
Now, I gotta admit, even I get a little lost sometimes with all the jargon that gets thrown around. So can we just, lay it out in plain English? What exactly is critical race theory?
Sure, sure. So critical race theory, or CRT, it's basically a way of looking at how racism isn't just about, individual prejudice.
Mm.
It's about how it's woven into our laws, our institutions, the very fabric of our society.
Mm.
It challenges the idea that racism is just a few bad apples
Yeah.
and says, no, it's deeper than that.
Okay.
It's baked into the system.
And then we've got this phrase, radical gender ideology.
Right, and that one's a bit trickier.
Yeah, it feels a little bit like a catch-all term, doesn't it?
It does. And it's often used, I'd say, more by conservatives
Mm.
to describe a whole bunch of ideas related to gender identity and expression.
Hmm.
So things like, the idea that gender is fluid,
Yeah.
that it's not necessarily tied to the sex you're assigned at birth,
Yeah.
and that there are more than just two genders.
Okay, so how does all of this actually play out in a classroom?
Right.
I mean, the executive order gives some examples, right?
It does, yeah.
There's this policy at Harrisonburg City Public Schools
Mm.
where teachers have to use a student's preferred name and pronouns.
Right, and that gets right to the heart of this debate about transgender rights and how schools should handle it, right?
Yeah.
You've got people who say, this is just basic respect, acknowledging who a student says they are.
Right.
And then you've got others who see it as, an attack on traditional gender roles, like we're trying to indoctrinate kids or something.
And then there's this other example, the policy at Madison Metropolitan School District that talks about disrupting the gender binary.
Right, right. And that goes a step further, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
It's not just about accommodating trans students.
Hmm.
It's about questioning this whole idea of gender as we know it.
Okay, so we've got these examples, these policies that are being held up as, evidence of these dangerous ideologies infiltrating schools. But how would this executive order actually work? It's not like the federal government can just, storm into a school and shut it down.
No, you're right. It's much more about using federal funding as a lever.
Hmm.
So the Education Department's Office for Civil Rights, they would investigate if a school was accused of teaching these concepts.
Hmm.
And then they could potentially withhold federal funding.
Okay, so it's like a financial pressure tactic.
Exactly.
But, that's a pretty big hammer to swing, isn't it? I mean, that could have a devastating impact on schools, especially those that are already struggling.
Oh, absolutely. And it creates this climate of fear, right? Where schools are so afraid of losing funding that they might avoid teaching anything remotely controversial.
And how do you even define what's controversial? I mean, what one person considers critical race theory, another person might just call it, teaching history.
That's exactly the point. It's so subjective, so open to interpretation.
Mm.
And that's where the vagueness of this order becomes really dangerous.
Yeah, it feels like a recipe for chaos and confusion, doesn't it?
It really does. And it's why you see groups like Human Rights Watch coming out so strongly against it.
What are they saying?
They're arguing that this order is basically designed to silence any discussion of race and racism in schools.
Hmm.
One researcher, Trey Walk, put it this way. This is a quote. Students have a right to learn about how discrimination can be entrenched in law and society. If the U.S. denies young people this knowledge, it has little hope of eradicating racism.
That's pretty powerful stuff, and it really gets to the heart of this debate, doesn't it? It's about whether we want our students to understand these complex issues or whether we're afraid of them grappling with uncomfortable
Right.
truths.
It's about what kind of citizens we're raising.
And this isn't just happening in a vacuum. This executive order is part of this, well, this wave, really, of conservative pushback against what they see as, liberal content in schools.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a pattern we've been seeing for a while now.
hmm
Curriculum changes, book bans, this whole idea that there's some kind of agenda being pushed in schools.
Yeah, and it seems like the term critical race theory itself has become this kind of weaponized buzzword.
It has. And that makes it even harder to have a nuanced conversation about these issues.
It does, because it's like people are talking past each other. They're not even using the same definition of the term.
Right. And that just creates more division, more polarization.
Okay, so we've got a lot to unpack here with this first executive order. It's complex, potentially far-reaching, and definitely sparking some heated
Oh,
debates.
sure.
Now, let's turn our attention to the second executive order, the one focused on anti-Semitism on college campuses. This one gets even more complicated, I think, when you consider the whole global context.
It does. And it's coming at a time when tensions are already really high, especially after the 2023 Israel-Hamas war.
Right. So this order basically directs the Justice Department to investigate and punish acts of anti-Semitism on college campuses.
Right. And on the surface, that might sound reasonable enough.
Yeah, who's going to argue against combating anti-Semitism?
Exactly. But it's the specifics of the order, the language, the focus that are raising all these red flags.
Yeah, because a big part of that focus is on deporting non-resident aliens,
Hmm.
which seems to be a direct line back to some of Trump's previous statements about cracking down on international students who participate in pro-Palestinian protests.
It does. And you can't ignore the timing of this order,
Mhm.
right? It comes right after this wave of protests on college campuses, some of which, yes, did lead to arrests.
Right, right. So it feels like this order is a direct response to that, almost like a way of saying, we're not going to tolerate this kind of dissent.
That's how a lot of people are interpreting it. And they're worried about the chilling effect this could have on free speech and peaceful protest.
And then there's the language of the order itself, which is pretty loaded.
Oh, yeah.
Talks about, protecting law and order, quelling pro-Hamas vandalism and intimidation,
Right.
and even calls out leftist, anti-American colleges and universities. I mean, that's some pretty strong rhetoric right there.
It is. And that's what's drawing so much criticism from civil rights groups.
Yeah.
They're saying this order is basically targeting pro-Palestinian activism and could be used to silence any criticism of Israeli policies.
Yeah, because where do you draw the line between legitimate protest and something that crosses over into, hate speech or support for terrorism?
Exactly. That line is not always clear, and it's open to interpretation.
Right. And that's where things get really tricky. Because if the definition of anti-Semitism becomes too broad, it could be used to silence anyone who expresses dissenting views.
Absolutely, and that's a dangerous precedent to set.
It is, and it's why this order has so many people worried.
Right. It's not just about this one issue.
hmm
It's about the potential erosion of our fundamental freedoms.
Okay, so we've got these two executive orders, both dealing with incredibly sensitive and complex issues, and it feels like they're both tapping into these deeper societal anxieties and fears.
They are. We're seeing this clash of ideologies, this battle over what it means to be American, what values we prioritize, and it's playing out in our schools, in our courts, in our media, everywhere.
It's like this giant puzzle box, and we're all trying to figure out how the pieces fit together, but the picture keeps changing.
It does, and it's frustrating, and it's scary, but it's also a reminder of how important it is to stay engaged, to stay informed, to keep asking questions.
Yeah, because this conversation is far from over.
Oh, it's just beginning, and it's a conversation we all need to be a part of.
Absolutely. So stay tuned, folks, because we're going to keep digging into this, exploring different perspectives, and try and make sense of it all.
All right, ready for part 2?
Let's do it. All right. So we've laid the groundwork. We've got these two executive orders, one targeting K-12 schools and the other zeroing in on college campuses.
Right.
And they're both stirring up a lot of dust, raising questions about, well, everything from education to free speech to how we even talk about these really sensitive topics like race and religion.
Yeah.
So where do we even go from here?
I think it's important to keep in mind that these orders aren't just like isolated events.
Yeah.
They're part of this much bigger, I'd say, struggle over Like the story of America.
Mm.
Who gets to tell it? Whose voices get heard? Whose get silenced?
Mm.
That's what's really at stake here, I think.
And that struggle is playing out everywhere, right? I mean, you see it on social media,
Oh, yeah.
in the news, in school board meetings, even, like families arguing at the dinner table.
Absolutely. It's every.
It's like this constant tug of war over what's true, what's acceptable, what's American.
Yeah. And it can feel really overwhelming, honestly.
It does. So let's try to break it down a bit. Let's start with the K-12 order and how it could actually impact what's being taught in classrooms.
Okay.
I mean, how do you even regulate something as, well, I don't know, as fluid and as nuanced as like teaching history or social studies?
It's a great question.
Hmm.
And frankly, that's where a lot of the concern lies.
Mm.
The order is so vague, it leaves so much room for interpretation.
Yeah. I mean, what one person sees as, critical race theory, another person might just call, like, teaching about slavery or Jim Crow or redlining.
Exactly. And that vagueness creates this chilling effect. Teachers are going to be afraid to teach anything that could be, even remotely controversial.
So they end up self-censoring just to be safe.
Right. They stick to the textbook. They avoid difficult conversations. And that's not real education, is it?
It's not. And it does a disservice to the students.
It does.
Now, I know there are already some legal challenges brewing against this order.
Yeah.
What's the latest on that front?
Well, the ACLU and the NAACP, among others, they're arguing that this order violates the First Amendment, freedom of speech, academic freedom. They're saying it's an attempt to control what can be taught and learned in schools.
Yeah.
And that's a dangerous precedent to set.
And that's probably going to be a long legal battle, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
This is going to be tied up in courts for years, most likely.
So in the meantime, we've got teachers who are, scared to teach, students who might be missing out on a full education, and this whole conversation about race and racism in schools has become even more, even more like a minefield.
It has. And it's sad because these are conversations we need to be having.
We do.
But we need to have them in a way that's constructive, not divisive.
Right, right. Now let's talk about the other executive order, the one targeting anti-Semitism on college campuses and specifically international students. This one feels particularly, fraught, especially given the recent conflict between Israel and Hamas.
It is. And it's really raising concerns about how we balance free speech with, the need to combat hate and discrimination.
Right. So this order essentially says that if an international student is found to be, violating laws, they could be deported.
Right.
And that sounds, on the surface, maybe reasonable, right? But it's the potential for overreach, the vagueness of what constitutes a violation that's worrying people.
It is. Because what one person sees as, legitimate criticism of Israeli policies, another person might see as anti-Semitism.
Exactly. And that line can be blurry.
It can.
So you have these students who are, already navigating a new culture, a new language, a new academic system.
Right.
And now they have to worry that expressing their political views, even peacefully, could get them kicked out of the country.
It's a lot of pressure. And it creates this climate of fear and self-censorship.
Yeah, it's like they're being told, you're welcome here, but only if you stay silent.
Right. And that's not what America should be about.
It's not.
We should be a place where people can express their views, even if they're unpopular, without fear of reprisal.
And, we talked earlier about that quote from Edward Ahmed Mitchell, where he compared these students to those who protested Vietnam or apartheid.
Right, right.
It's a powerful comparison because it reminds us that dissent is often a catalyst for social change.
It is.
And if we silence those voices, we risk stifling progress.
Absolutely.
So we've got these two executive orders, both aimed at, supposedly protecting students, but both raising serious concerns about freedom of speech, academic freedom, and the very values that underpin our democracy.
Yeah, it's a mess.
It is. So what do we do? I mean, how do we, as individuals, as citizens, how do we navigate this?
Well, I think the first step is to resist the urge to simplify, to reduce everything to, us versus them, good versus bad. These issues are complex. There are nuances. There are gray areas.
Right.
And we need to be willing to engage with that complexity.
So it's not about finding the right answer. It's about asking the right questions.
Exactly. It's about being curious, being critical, being open to different perspectives.
It's about being uncomfortable sometimes.
It is.
And that's okay.
It is. Because that's how we learn. That's how we grow.
So how do we do that? How do we cultivate that kind of mindset, that kind of, intellectual humility?
Well, for starters, we need to be more mindful of where we're getting our information. Are we stuck in an echo chamber only listening to people who agree with us?
Right.
Or are we seeking out diverse viewpoints, challenging our own assumptions?
So it's about diversifying our media diet, stepping outside of our comfort zones.
Exactly. But it's also about how we engage with that information.
Mm.
Are we passively consuming or are we actively questioning, analyzing, evaluating?
So we need to be more critical, more discerning.
We do.
Yeah.
And we need to be more aware of our own biases.
Right.
What assumptions are we bringing to the table? How are those assumptions shaping our understanding of the world?
It's about like constantly checking ourselves,
It is.
making sure we're not just reinforcing our own preconceived notions.
Exactly.
So we're being more mindful of our information sources, we're engaging more critically, we're checking our own biases.
Right.
What's next? Where do we go from there?
Well, then it's about taking action.
Mm.
It's not enough to just be informed. We need to be engaged.
So what does that look like? Give us some concrete examples.
Sure, it can be as simple as starting a conversation with someone who holds a different viewpoint.
Hmm.
But remember, it's not about trying to win an argument.
Right.
It's about listening, understanding, finding common ground.
It's about building bridges, not walls.
Exactly. But it can also be about getting involved in your community, supporting organizations that align with your values,
Hmm.
contacting your elected officials, maybe even running for office yourself.
So there are lots of ways to make a difference, big and small.
There are. And it doesn't have to be overwhelming.
Right.
Start small. Find what you're passionate about and go from there.
Phew. Okay, so we've talked about a lot. These two executive orders, the debates they're sparking, the potential fallout.
Heavy stuff.
It is. But you know what? I think feeling a little overwhelmed means we're actually, engaging with it.
I agree. It means we're taking it seriously.
Yeah. So now the question is, what do we do about it?
Right. How do we move from, like, feeling paralyzed
Yeah.
to actually taking action?
Exactly. So where do we even begin?
I think the first thing, honestly, is to resist the urge to oversimplify.
Hmm.
It's easy to get caught up in the sound bites, the partisan talking points.
Yeah, it's us versus them, good versus bad.
Right. But these issues are way too nuanced for that.
So you're saying we need to embrace the messiness of it all?
I am. Lean into the discomfort. Be okay with not having all the answers.
Because the moment you think you've got it all figured out, you've probably stopped learning, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how do we cultivate that mindset, that curiosity, that critical thinking in ourselves and in others?
Yeah, good question. It feels like it starts with being more intentional about, where we even get our information from.
Absolutely. Think about your media diet. Are you stuck in an echo chamber, just hearing the same opinions over and over again?
Yeah.
Or are you actively seeking out diverse viewpoints?
So it's not just about what we read or watch or listen to, it's about how we're doing it, right?
Right. Are we just passively scrolling, or are we engaging with the material?
So are we questioning things, analyzing, really thinking critically about what we're seeing and hearing?
Exactly. Ask yourself, who wrote this? Why? What's their agenda? What's the context here? What am I not being told?
It's almost like we need to be detectives, right? Constantly interrogating the information we're bombarded with.
Exactly. And you know what else? We need to be detectives about our own WM biases.
Oh, that's a good one.
What are my preconceived notions? What assumptions am I bringing to the table?
Yeah.
How is that shaping what I see and hear?
Okay, so we're being more mindful about where we get our information. We're being more critical of it. We're checking our own biases at the door.
Right. That's the foundation. But then what do we do with all of that?
That's the big question, right? How do we take all this new understanding and turn it into action?
Well, it can be as simple as starting a conversation. Talk to a friend or family member who has a different view, but don't go in trying to win or change their mind.
Right, it's not a debate.
It's about listening, trying to see things from their perspective.
Finding that common ground, even if it's just a sliver.
Exactly. Building those bridges.
But it can also be bigger than that, right?
Absolutely. Get involved in your community. Volunteer. Support organizations that are fighting for the things you believe in.
Right.
Contact your elected officials. Heck, run for office yourself.
There are a lot of options depending on, how much time and energy you have.
Exactly. You don't have to do it all. Find what speaks to you. What are you passionate about? What lights you up?
Follow that passion, that curiosity.
Yes, because that's how you'll stay motivated, even when things get tough.
And this is a marathon, not a sprint.
It is. There will be times when you feel discouraged, like nothing's changing.
Yeah, like what's the point?
Right. But those are the times to remember WHY you're doing this. What's that vision you have for the future?
What kind of world do you want to leave for your kids, for your grandkids?
Exactly. Remember that and keep going.
Yeah.
Because even the smallest act of courage, the smallest act of resistance can make a difference.
It can spark a conversation, inspire someone else, create that ripple effect.
Exactly. And you know what?
What?
That's how change happens. It starts small.
It does, and it takes all of us working together.
It does. And that's what I find hopeful, even amidst all this chaos and uncertainty.
Me too, because it reminds us that we're not powerless. We do have a voice. We can make a difference.
Exactly.
Well, folks, I think that about wraps up our deep dive for today.
It does. It's been a journey.
It has. And we've covered a lot of ground, from executive orders to critical thinking to finding your voice. We've seen how these issues are complex, how they're interconnected, and how they ultimately touch all of our lives.
And we've talked about how, even though it can feel overwhelming, we're not powerless.
Right. We can choose to stay informed, to engage in these difficult conversations, to take action in ways that feel meaningful to us.
That's right.
So as always, thank you for listening. Keep asking those tough questions, keep challenging yourselves, and keep fighting for the world you want to see.